Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you with us today. Another great live stream. And our presenter today will share about how you can have a successful 1031 exchange. So you'll definitely want to tune in. My name is Jeff Fowler with the Apartment Owners Association, and just want to say hello to all of you members out there and everyone watching. It's so good to have you with us. And AOA, if you don't know, we're one of the largest individually organized groups of apartment owners here in the state of California. And it has just been a blast to interact with everybody, all the new not all the new members, but many of them I get to I have contact with, and so it's been great. Want to let you know we have a magazine. This goes out every month. If you're a member and you're not getting it, please update your address. If you haven't gotten it yet this month, it's because there was a massive COVID outbreak, and the people that actually put the magazine together, at the printing press, many of them were out, so this has been delayed, and there are even supply chain issues. So please bear with us and know that if you haven't gotten it this month, it's because it just hasn't gotten there yet. So thank you for your patience. And also, I don't know if you've realized this, but at the first part of the magazine, we have all these categories, and you can look up a contractor or a vendor to help you with what you're doing. These people are specifically trying to reach real estate investors, and so they're going to give you an investor price. You're not going to be paying retail when you use those guys in there, hopefully. And if you ever have problems, let us know, and we even mediate, just kind of hold the vendors accountable if we need to. And anyway, so just know that that's a resource for you. And also just want to say that their closed caption is available on Facebook. So if you go to the Facebook platform, that'll be able to get it for you. And we had a couple of weeks back, we had Dennis Block speak, and this is a must-watch video. If you have not seen that video, please go back and watch that one. And Brennan as well also brought new laws. Both of these videos, if you go to AOA USA, search that on YouTube, and everything comes up. You'll definitely want to check those out. And one of the things, people in LA City, they may not know, but your eviction moratorium has been extended up in Alameda County, all over the place. Things have been, they're just continuing to extend. And this has been way too long, right? So some of you may know the pun about this coming Tuesday, but it's 2/22/2022. That's the date. It's also a Tuesday. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a movement. Your district county supervisor, as well as your city council member. And so we have an article. So this is Tuesday with a 2, not just the whole thing, as you can see it on the screen. So on Tuesday, between 2 and 3, we're going to make 2 phone calls and tell them it's been too long to have these eviction moratoriums. And we even have talking points for you on the website. So if you go to the AOA website, the featured article will give you even the talking points. But basically, we have the rent relief for tenants that have been impacted by COVID. There's rent relief. There's no need to have an eviction ban. And then also just how this program, it encourages people to, it encourages non-payment of rent and more debt for residents. So we want to frame it. We're going to switch it around a little bit and try to frame it from the perspective of why this is bad for tenants. And anyway, all those points are there. You definitely want to check that out. And then there's even a link in there. You're like, well, Jeff, I don't know who my representatives are. Well, this is the perfect time, because in that article on the website, that's aoausa.com, in the article, there's a link, and you can click on that. You put in your address, and it will tell you who all of your representatives are. And so this is it's a kind of a pun of a day, but at the same time, change is in the air. Good things can happen, and what are we expecting? What are we believing? Are we living a defeated life, or are we going to try to live in victory? And so let's bring ourselves back up and let's do this thing. So that's what's going on. And then the next couple weeks, tax implications for LLC, C Corp, or S Corp, and then several other things next week. We're going to be talking about that in the live stream. So you're going to definitely want to catch that one. And then we're going to have one on self-storage, how you can make money from self-storage units, and then also one on mold. So if you haven't subscribed, subscribe. And definitely subscribe to the newsletter that we have. Whether you're a member or not, you can subscribe. If you're a member and you're not getting it, contact us and let's figure out if we don't have your right email address or if you have it going in your spam folder. And so that's a lot of announcements. And so now we get to it. So our sponsor is Real Estate Transition Solutions, and they are a real estate investment advisory firm, and they do $220 million in DST properties every year, and they've been around for a long time. And anyway, so our speaker, he is the partner at Real Estate Transition Solutions, and he's a guy that's grown up with real estate investment his whole life, real savvy, worked for PricewaterhouseCoopers, and he's been with Real Estate Transition Solutions for 4 or 5 years now. And so it's my pleasure to introduce to you today Austin Bowlin.
All right, Jeff, I appreciate the introduction there and the opportunity to share with the AOA membership. As mentioned, my name is Austin Bowlin. I'm a partner at Real Estate Transition Solutions. And today I'm going to be presenting on the 1031 exchange planning and staging process, how to effectively and efficiently plan for a 1031 exchange. We have a good amount of content ahead of us today, so we're going to be moving fairly quickly through this topic, but looking forward to sharing on this subject matter. So one item to note, we'll mention in brief a replacement property option, a 1031 exchange replacement property option that's referred to as the Delaware Statutory Trust. There is a requirement that in order to invest or exchange into Delaware Statutory Trusts, you must be what is considered an accredited investor. Typically, accreditation is achieved by having a net worth in excess of $1 million, not including the value of your primary, or alternatively, there are income thresholds and various professional licenses and the like. Not the focus of today's presentation, but since it is mentioned, we're required to put this disclosure in there. Bit of background on our firm, Real Estate Transition Solutions. We are a real estate advisory group that really serves a owner profile that is making the transition from what we consider to be the third to the fourth quarter of property ownership. That's a period of time in which often owners are looking at the real estate that they own today, maybe actively managing, maybe overseeing third-party property management, and saying, I would prefer to have less active involvement. I prefer to have more diversification, prefer to likely have an increased income, maybe avoid the regulatory environment that we all know and love in the state of California and various municipalities, but is quite pervasive all the way up the West Coast through Oregon and Washington as well. Looking at estate planning as well, co-ownership arrangements, liquidity strategies, we come alongside those property owners to understand their objectives, understand the nature of the properties in which they own, and then provide and present replacement property and transition strategies should there be a gap between their objectives and the portfolio or single property that they currently own. The firm was founded about 20 years ago by my father, Roger Bowlin, who began his career in commercial real estate, followed by about 2 decades of more traditional wealth management, which is where we really built our framework for understanding clients' objectives, both financial and lifestyle. I joined the firm about 5.5 years ago at this point, as Jeff likely mentioned, the CPA by background, worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers previous to working here, first in their audit practice, followed by their mergers and acquisitions advisory group. Beyond Roger and I, we have a team of exchange advisors, a full due diligence team, operations and investor relations team, and the like. What we have here is an overview of what we're going to be covering over the next, call it 20 minutes or so. So really working through systematically what the organization planning process looks like in order to have a 1031 exchange transaction that's going to best position you to realize your objectives moving forward. So we're going to talk about the concept of the exchange timeline. We're going to talk about building an exchange team, the role that an exchange advisor, such as our firm plays in this process. And we'll touch on the tax liability calculation. It's a very key consideration when discussing a 1031 exchange. Talk about owner objectives and considerations that are taken into account, and then walk through some ownership types and then ultimately replacement property options in brief before we close things down. When we talk about the 1031 exchange timeline, most individuals jump to the IRS's mandated timeline of opening an exchange before the close of your sale. Then upon the close, you have 45 days to identify replacement property, followed by a sequential 135 days to actually complete the purchase of that replacement property. From our standpoint, the process in order to stage for and execute a efficient and effective 1031 exchange really begins much sooner than that. It starts with knowing the key inputs, and perhaps the most important one there is what is your tax liability that would be due if you were to sell the property and not perform an exchange. From there, it moves into what we consider the education or foundations chapter, in which you're starting to gather information to make sure that you know what the rules and requirements are with the 1031 exchange. And this is a piece where both steps 1, 2, and 3, and 4, frankly, are where an exchange advisor can lend quite a bit of value to a property owner. So understanding the timeline, the debt matching requirements, the identification rules, co-ownership arrangements, and how to work through those, that's all going to be in step 2 here. And then from step 3, now we move into the dialoguing about objectives, both financial and lifestyle, in order to build the framework out as to what's going to be the criteria for selecting appropriate replacement property. This in our work with clients is very much a dialogue and interview process so that we can seek to understand where a property owner is coming from, what they're trying to accomplish. From there, we'll move into getting the lay of the land of what replacement property options are going to be suitable, as well as where the market is at for those properties. How quickly would you need to move on acquiring that property? What would be the potential return profile of that particular market, that particular property type? All of this is done before the property that will fund the exchange, the relinquished property, is sold and then exchanged. Once all of that prep work is taken care of, now you're free to go about selling your property with the typical process that you would if you were to pay tax. You could sell to a tenant, you could sell private party, you could utilize a broker, and then have that property marketed as widely as possible. If you're in Southern California, AOA has some fantastic resources there in terms of brokerage capabilities to market and then ultimately sell a building of yours. Once that property is sold, or rather once you're under contract to sell that property with a buyer, then you're going to want to set up your 1031 exchange with a qualified intermediary. If there's only one thing that you walk away from today's presentation remembering, it would be that if you are planning to do a 1031 exchange, you must open up your 1031 exchange with a qualified intermediary before that sale closes. And ideally, 1 to 2 or 3 weeks in advance of that sale closing so that there's plenty of buffer there. You cannot retroactively decide to perform a 1031 exchange. So if you have closed on your sale, at that point, the exchange is no longer viable. From there, we now move into all the way at step 7, what many would consider to be the standard exchange timeline, which is identifying replacement property in 45 days, and then ultimately closing on that property within 180 days of the date of sale. And then lastly, making sure that your tax preparer has all of the necessary information in order for them to complete that Form 8824 that will account for the 1031 exchange and show the IRS, show the franchise tax board why you're not paying tax on this transaction because it has all been deferred. Now, often the question is, who needs to sit at the table throughout this process? Who are the advisors, the entities that are going to play a role in it? First, there's the licensed exchange advisor. Now, that individual is going to be able to walk alongside you to make sure that the exchange rules are met, to guide you in terms of any sort of co-ownership arrangements, preparatory work done up front to address your objectives. Maybe you want to have liquidity coming out of the transaction, but don't want to pay tax. So a refinance in advance of the sale might be something that would be recommended. Various components and strategies such as that. You also will need a qualified intermediary. That is effectively exchange escrow, but they will hold on to the sales proceeds while performing an exchange so that then you do not take what the IRS considers to be constructive receipt or possession of the funds. And so very important role there as well, and very much necessary for a safe harbor exchange. Your commercial real estate broker or agent, they can go about selling your property as normal. There's really not any added complexity from that standpoint. And then your tax advisor, your CPA, should also be involved in the front end conversations as to whether or not the tax liability makes sense to execute an exchange. And then, of course, we'll need the necessary information to report the transaction after the fact. Here's a quick overview, some of which we've touched on already, as to the role that the exchange advisor plays in the process. But without a question, it is a role that adds significant value. And frankly, what you're doing is you're able to leverage the expertise of an advisor who has worked through hundreds of exchanges. And for most, a 1031 exchange is at the most frequent, maybe something that's done every few years. But for many, it's either their first time or they haven't performed an exchange for 10, 15, 20 years. So bringing that exchange advisor in to work alongside you can add a significant amount of value and avoid some costly mistakes that could end up triggering substantial taxes. The process of understanding a tax liability is often misunderstood by property owners. There's a few key components that need to be reflected in the tax liability. What you see is the 4 taxes that are typically going to apply to the sale of property. First, you have your federal capital gains rate. Or capital gains tax rather, that's going to be 15 to 20%. You have your state capital gains, which here in California is up to 13.3%. You have your depreciation recapture tax, which is a flat rate of 25%. And then all of that can also be subject to an additional 3.8% by way of the net investment income tax. What often is misunderstood is the fact that when you are selling a property, that depreciation recapture is overlooked. And it's actually the dollars that the IRS and Franchise Tax Board will apply first to any withheld proceeds from an exchange. So for example, if you're selling a $2 million property and you say, I'd like to withhold $500,000 of proceeds so that I can receive some cash, but you have $650,000 of accumulated depreciation on your property. That's the aggregate of all of the annual depreciation you've taken over the period of ownership. The IRS is going to apply that 25% rate against the entire $500,000 in which you end up withholding from that exchange. And Franchise Tax Board is going to apply their applicable rate. You'll probably, depending on your income, somewhere around 10% on top of that. So while not always the wrong thing to do, I mean, there's a place for withholding proceeds without a doubt, but it can be quite costly because the IRS will skim the cream off the top, if you will, from the most expensive tax dollars. We'll walk through a quick example here of what a capital gains tax and depreciation recapture tax calculation looks like. So what we have is property that was sold for $350,000. Transaction costs, so brokerage, title, escrow, sum up to $250,000. Those are deductible. Then we have an original purchase price of $850,000 plus $200,000 of improvements that were implemented in the property over the period of ownership. That creates an original tax basis of $1,050,000, followed by then depreciation taken over the life of ownership of $750,000. So that would be what you'll hear referred to as accumulated depreciation. What that gets us to then is, if you look over on the green box up above, the estimated taxable gain would be the total net sales proceeds at $3.25 million, less the original basis in the property. What that gets us to is the amount of capital gain. That capital gain is going to be subject to the 15 to 20% rate federally, as well as then state income tax. The accumulated depreciation that was taken, that $750,000 that you see in red there in the middle box, that's going to be taxed at the flat rate of 25% federally plus state income tax, and both of which can be subject to the net investment income tax of 3.8. So all told, on a fairly heavily depreciated building, but not an unrealistic scenario at all. By the looks of these figures, this property was purchased for $850,000. It's now worth $3.5 million. Would have been owned for around 25 years, 24, 25 years, based off of the amount of depreciation taken. You're looking at a tax liability of over $1.1 million. Now, objectives are a very key piece of developing an exchange strategy. And why that's the case is because these objectives are going to ultimately be the framework through which any replacement property options are stacked up against and evaluated through. What we commonly see when working with property owners who are in that third to fourth quarter period, which is the profile in which we work with, are the objectives that you'll see up above here. So it could be reduction or elimination, deferral of tax. It can be enhancement of income. It can be liquidity. It can be eliminating or reducing management responsibility, maybe not across the board, but perhaps in your portfolio of real estate, there are a few problem properties or bad actors that just seem to take more time and energy than the others. Looking for diversification. It's very common for a property owner to own a portfolio of a single property type in a single geographic area, which is a great way to build your net worth. But when we start looking at 60, 70, 80 years old, and preservation of capital and income, generating income is typically higher on the objective list than actual accumulation and growth. Diversification can lend itself toward that. The considerations that need to get taken into account, you'll see over there on the other side of the slide, anything from the ownership structure to the timeline to what your financial objectives are, risk tolerance, et cetera. When we talk about replacement property options, there are three broad categories from an ownership structure standpoint. So you're going to have fee simple properties. That will include any properties in which you own and likely manage yourself or use third-party property management, but you have control over that particular property in its entirety. When it comes to financing, the decision to ultimately sell the property, capital improvements to the property, all of the opportunities and responsibilities associated with owning real estate. Then you have your Delaware statutory trust property up at the top. That's what I had mentioned at the very beginning on that second slide. What this is a form of fractional ownership that allows you to exchange into owning just a percentage of larger institutional properties. Say, for instance, a 300-unit multifamily property in Dallas, Texas, or an Amazon fulfillment center in Michigan. Tendency in common is similar to that in the sense that it's also fractional ownership. A main distinction being one can be a little bit more opportunistic with this property type or ownership structure, and it doesn't have the same parameters that really focus the DST on owning stabilized income producing properties. There's also different property types to take into account. And each property type has its own dynamics and considerations and behaves in its own way throughout various market cycles. You have multifamily, self-storage, hospitality that tend to respond very favorably to inflationary environments. You have net lease, industrial that tend to do very well in down economies, being that bellwether, stable, predictable income throughout. Each of which has their own dynamics from a lending standpoint, from a value add standpoint, all of which can be blended together when you're looking at forms of ownership like the DST. But if you're looking at fee simple property, you typically want to build a skill set and focus and stay in that skill set moving forward. When you're looking at replacement property options, like all things, there's really two main paths. You can either work with someone who has been through this process before and can walk alongside you, the exchange advisor, or you can take more of a do-it-yourself approach and look online at websites that will have properties available, whether that is by way of Zillow or Trulia or LoopNet, or even some of the DSTs would be made publicly available that you can see information about. Won't be able to transact on your own, but there are some that will provide with very limited guidance. So either way is available to you. We gravitate toward the exchange advisor, as you can imagine, given that is going to create the most customizable approach. If you are interested in seeing illustrative DST properties, given that this is often the form of ownership that owners are less familiar with, certainly can visit our website, and we have a portal that is really built specifically for AOA members. So the website is re-transition.com/AOA. And what you'll see there is access to a listing of both recently closed and currently available DST properties, as well as our two guides. And these are both fantastic educational resources. I would highly recommend downloading these and reading them or reviewing them. First is our guide to understanding 1031 exchanges, and the second being our guide to investing in Delaware statutory trusts. Webinars are also a near weekly occurrence with our firm. And so if you'd like to join for a webinar, you can find the upcoming events listed on the AOA site. So re-transition.com/AOA. And you can also sign up for a complimentary consultation if you're interested in discussing the specifics of your situation, what it is that you're considering and evaluating, or have any questions about any of the content in which was shared today or that you find on our website. Always happy to set you up with an exchange advisor and have that conversation. Last time, for those of you who did not take it down on earlier slides, what we have is the re-transition.com/AOA. And also one other resource listed on that site that I forgot to mention, but should have a few slides ago, is we do have a tax liability calculator included on that webpage as well. So if you want to type in the figures that are applicable to your particular property, when you purchased it, what you paid, what you think it's worth now, then it will produce an estimated tax liability for purposes of having that information. So with that, we have a couple of frequently asked questions here, but I'm going to hand it back over to Jeff to see if he would prefer to go straight to audience questions, or of course we can take a lap through these as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Austin. And yeah, so we'll take questions now. So the best way for you to get your question in, if you're on the AOAUSA.com website, is there's a blue help button down at the bottom right side. You can put your question in there and it will they'll get it to me, and then definitely YouTube, Facebook, you put a question in the chat, we'll be able to get to it. And so right now I don't see any questions, so definitely go ahead and put questions in. And then also just to recap, coming Tuesday it's a play on words, but it's a Tuesday because it's 2/22/2022. And again, we're asking for people to make 2 phone calls between 2 and 3. We want to swarm phones for the for the district supervisors I'm sorry, county supervisors, whether it's LA County or whether it's Alameda or wherever. And we want you to call and either say thank you if they voted for ending eviction moratoriums, or call them and say, hey, this has been too long. And so if you could join in doing that. And one thing I didn't mention, Austin, I can't believe it, but there's a specific search engine where if you type in the keywords, nothing comes up at all. And then if you go to DuckDuckGo and you type in these keywords, then immediately our website pops up. And we've done the SEO work. It's all green and smiley faces. So it's pretty interesting. This one's being suppressed. So this movement is being suppressed. So really, if you could share, go on the AOA USA website, it's on the homepage. You can click on the article, and even in the article, there's a link where you can find your representatives and call them, city council member, call in. But go into it knowing, like if you're in LA County, Barger, she voted against the tenant protections resolution that they just passed. If you're in Alameda, if you're up in Northern California, I think it's Alameda County, it was David Hubert, he voted against it. So don't just go in with guns loaded, know what their history is a little bit if you can. And let's affirm the people that are doing a good job and thank them. And then let's definitely give the others just some feedback, because they need it. And ultimately it's bad for everybody, but we're framing it so that it's bad for tenants. So, all right. So that's that. And great. Well, finally we have one question here. So that's good. I bought us a little time, and it's Rosie. How often can you do an exchange?
There's really no limitation on how often you can perform an exchange. There is a concept of if you purchase property and flip it and then turn around and sell it and try to exchange that multiple times over, that would reclassify that property as no longer being held for business or investment purposes, but instead it would be considered dealer inventory. And the tax implications are different. It's not going to be subject to capital gains any longer. You're going to have different sales tax associated with it, which you don't typically with real estate. So, if you are moving through properties with too regular velocity, then it could preclude you from being able to do an exchange. But as long as you hold on to property for longer than a year, you have income typically derived from it. You can sell that property multiple times over and continue exchanging until eventually you pass away, and that tax is then never paid.
All right, Kevin on YouTube. How long do you need to hold the up leg for the 1031 exchange before you can sell? Is that the same?
Similar question there. It's recommended that you hold on to it for at least a year. Yeah. Ideally, you have taxable income derived from that property in 2 different tax seasons.
Okay, here's a real common question. Ben on YouTube. Can I exchange a commercial property with a residential income property?
You absolutely can. So what the IRS is looking and is that they're saying we need the property to be like kind to one another, but that definition of like kind is not tied to the property type, but instead the reason as to why that property is held, the intent as to why it's held. In the IRS's eyes, there's only 2 different types of properties or 2 different intents. There's property that's held for personal use, which would include your primary residence or a vacation home. And then there's property that's held for business or investment purposes, and that's all other property. So if you're talking about a situation where you are selling a rental home that has rental income, it's not your primary, it's not your vacation home, and then exchanging that, you could absolutely exchange that into commercial property, larger scale multifamily, agricultural land, a hotel, motel, gas station, whatever you want there.
Great. All right, Tammy on YouTube. Can I use the 1031 exchange property as a primary residence? And what is the tax consequence?
Eventually, you can. It's typically recommended that you have rental income derived from that property for at least a year. It's not uncommon for a tax preparer to say 2 years, and then from that point forward, you can use it as a primary. And there are no real tax consequences associated with it. You're going to still have that tax deferral. Only difference being that upon the eventual sale, you would not be able to exchange out of it. You could still use your Section 121 exclusion, provided you live in it for at least 2 years, but you wouldn't be able to perform a 1031 exchange out of it unless it then became a rental again.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right, Jesse on YouTube, any resource as to who could help with the exchange?
What's the question there?
Any resource as to who could help with the exchange? Do you have a list available? Who could
I see, like a directory of some sort. When it comes to a qualified intermediary, we've worked with most qualified intermediaries on the West Coast at this point. And if you want to send us a message, we absolutely can provide recommendations there. Tax preparers as well, not worked with most. I mean, there are tens of thousands of them, but certainly can provide recommendations. That can be one in which individuals prefer to have a little more local relationships. That's going to depend on where you live, if that is a goal of yours. Exchange advisor, that's us. That's what we do. That's our work. And then brokerage, we have extensive relationships and a very strong network there as well. If you're looking at someplace like Oregon, Washington, Eastern or Western, if you're in Southern California, obviously AOA is a great option there. We don't have a published directory, but if you want to connect with us, we can certainly connect you with whomever we feel like would serve you best.
Right. And thanks you gave a plug earlier as well. Thanks for the plug as far as
you
the
bet.
brokerage. And that's LA, San Fernando Valley, LA area only.
Yep.
That we serve, and actually we were at brokerage before we were an association. So Dan Fowler, the founder, he's a broker. That's what he did. He doesn't sell anymore, but there are plenty of guys of agents left here still that besides, not Dan, but other guys that have been doing it for 30 plus years. And so they've been around the block a few times, and they'll definitely enough experience to get you a great price, and then on to Austin so he can help you get the DST. All right, so Sanjeev, I've heard of a reverse 1031 exchange. Can you buy your goal property and then sell the property, assuming you can afford it?
That's exactly it right there. You definitely can. It does require typically having the capital available in order to purchase your replacement property before you've sold what would be called your relinquished property. So there's a little bit more nuance to that, and there's some complication. It's not undoable. I mean, it happens regularly. They do cost a little bit more from a qualified intermediary standpoint than your traditional exchange. But very much a option, and for those that have the capital to do so, it's not an uncommon option.
Great. All right, on Facebook, Lorna Joy, Real Estate Transitions 2 guides, the 1031 exchange and DSTs are brilliant. Reading those, I went from knowing nothing about 1031s to being well informed. Highly recommended. Okay, now Lorna Joy, does she work for you or what?
I mean, she's not on the payroll, if that's what you're asking, but maybe she should be.
Wow.
That's great. Appreciate the positive feedback there.
Well, that's great. And that makes me happy because, I mean, ultimately what we're trying to do for our members is give them ideas that'll help them make or keep more money. We talk about that all the time. Our goal is their success. And so that's great that we're able to point them to you and definitely get that. And I see the website, it's along the bottom there, Real Estate Transition Solutions, that website, and then the /AOA, and definitely go there. There's good resources there for everybody. And so I love that one. You don't see that a whole lot. I haven't seen that clear of a plug for anybody.
First time for us.
Well, no, I guess for Howard Jarvis, and we did the Howard Jarvis, and then also for Robert Hall and Associates,
Okay.
the tax
Yep.
preparer.
Yep.
So you're in a very small group.
Well, thank you, Arne. I appreciate that.
So yeah, so that's awesome. And right now we don't have any more. If you have another question, please let us know. And so I'll just make final announcements. And hopefully, if you have a question, there's only bad questions are one that you don't ask, I guess. But just want to say, next week we will have. What do we have next week? Oh, tax implications for an LLC, C Corp, or S Corp, and then other new tax laws and just what's happening there. So you'll want to go for that one, and that's Robert Hall and Associates, who I just mentioned. And then we have one on storage units, how you can make money there, and then one on mold. And so next couple of weeks are pretty good. So definitely sign up for those events. Sometimes there's giveaways. So if you register, you might get something out of that. And so those are coming up, and great. And see, look, that bought us a little time. What is from Min Chung? What is the tax consequence if I pass the property to children and let them do a 1031 instead of me?
So if you pass away owning the real estate, it's held in your name when you pass. In a community property state like California, if you are married, your spouse would then receive the property and not have any tax consequences associated with it. That is what's referred to as a step up in basis. So they could turn around and sell that property the day after you passed without having to pay any capital gains, net investment income tax, depreciation recapture, or state tax. The same stands then when passing to beneficiaries. So unless your children are planning on owning that property for years and decades after they inherit it, then they likely will not need to do a 1031 exchange because the tax consequences will be so mitigated.
And it says, what if I pass the property to children? So maybe he's talking about putting it in their name before he's gone.
Yep. And that is something that comes up pretty regularly. If you gift before you pass away, then the property is going to be transitioned over to whomever you gifted it to, the recipient, at your basis. So all of the tax consequences that you would have would be applicable to that individual. And there are some nuances associated with gifting to children with the intent of the children selling, so that they're maybe in a lower tax bracket depending on the age of the children. Very much something you're going to want to talk to your tax preparer about if that's what you're considering.
Great. Right. And again, next week we have Robert Hall coming. So definitely.
Perfect.
Ask a lot of the tax questions there. And I mean, you were a CPA, so you know your stuff anyway. Mm-hmm. And an auditor and mergers and acquisitions at that, right? So you know your stuff. Right. Any final thoughts here?
No, appreciate the opportunity to share and all the advocacy and hard work that AOA is putting in fighting the good fight in California. It's important that there always be individual property owners. I mean, they're a key part of our social and economic fabric. So
right. And that's a really good point, because a lot of you may be watching and thinking, well, all of my tenants are paying, I don't need to call. But it's more about property rights than it is just yes, a lot of us are owed a lot of money, but even if you're not owed anything, it's for the whole industry. We have to think of it as just as the bigger picture. And with stuff coming up on April 1st, it's not only April Fool's Day, but man, a whole bunch of stuff slams down in LA County, even if you're LA City. And so just definitely be aware and think of it as a team effort and get out there, make a couple calls. And anyway, so well, anyway, thank you so much, Austin, for your time. And we'll let you go, and everybody will see you next week. And until then,
excellent.
Enjoy a long weekend too, right?
Appreciate the opportunity. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Austin. Okay.